I think we can start at this point. Okay, let's start. Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks for connecting with us today with me, Manuel. My name is Tony. I'm a software engineer at SciTech IT Consulting. You're watching a special edition of our format devjam. What is devjam? Devjam is about developers presenting a specific niche topic to other developers. And we have organized this meetup format since 2015, actually, always in real life, usually in a nice location in Amsterdam. But due to the current circumstances, we decided to move it to YouTube. And for many people, it's actually very convenient. Today we are here with Manuel. Welcome, Manuel.
Thank you, Dari.
And Manuel will talk about his experience at KLM on how to design APIs in a big enterprise environment. By the way, I would like to thank Manuel for being able to prepare this talk in a very, very fast time. So thanks for that. And at this point, I will let Manuel continue. So good luck, Manuel. Only thing, guys, if you have any questions about the talk, please write it in the live feed and we will check it at the end of the presentation. Okay, so Manuel, good luck.
Thank you, Tony, for the introduction. Well, guys, as you may know me, my name is Manuel. I've been working at Cytax in June last year, so for almost 1 year. I've worked for companies like Backbase or KLM, and as I said, as Tony said, I have been working with several APIs, different projects from big monolithics to microservices. So in this presentation, I want to cover what issues a developer may have when using, designing, or evolving an API, and how by following sub guidelines we can make our REST API strong. So let's move to the presentation. Okay, so then this is the summary of the presentation. I will try to involve you all in this presentation. So for that, I would like to define a problem that we want to solve. And then for that, we are going to define an API. My idea is to combine slides with doing some live coding to make this presentation a bit more engaging. As Tony said, this presentation will take around 40 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer turn. Well, first, as I said, we are going to define a problem. Then we are going to try to make an API for it. Then we are going to see how versioning works when software changes. And then last, we are going to check what's a REST API contract and how it works, how it can help us. Let's move to the warm up. So as I said, let's define a problem so then we can understand better how to design a strong REST API. So imagine that we want to keep track of the workshops we do here at SciTech. So in this particular example, we have 3 workshops, one about Java, one about Node.js, and one about APIs. And then we can see people that went to the Java workshop, and also people that went to the Java workshop, but also to the APIs workshop, right? So we want to keep track of that. So that's the first question for you guys all. How would you design this? It looks like a very simple model, right? It's not a very difficult one. So I would propose to have something like this. 2 entities, one called user and the other one called slab, what we are known as workshop, in which maybe for the users we can store just the first name and last name, and for the slabs we can store the name, the screenshot, and then the presenter, who's the presenter, and the list of attendees. Okay, as I said before, here below you have the repository that you can eventually later on check out and then see all the points that I'm going to comment in this presentation. I hope it's clear, everyone. Then let's move to the resources. So we have two entities. Then how do we map those resources to URLs? But before that, I want to explain that we, as developers, we develop many APIs and many apps that consumes those APIs, right? So let's say REST is not a strict standard. So then we find that many developers develop their API in a different way comparing to each other. So that makes the clients that consume them to sometimes have to have very custom things to adapt to those APIs. So that's why when you design an API, try to follow as much as possible the guidelines or the best practices that are already in the market and that we are going to discuss here. So let's first try to look for a first design for our problem. Well, first of all, what do we want to do with those two entities that we talk about? For imagine that we want to do CRUD operations for users and CRUD operations for slabs. So let's say we want to create and retrieve and update users, and we want to do exactly the same, plus delete for slabs. So then this is a first design that I propose that, spoiler alert, as you can see here, I would say it's not a very nice one, and I would say not any of you would be really happy to work with it, or not. What do you think, Tony?
Yeah, it's not super optimal. We can definitely do better. I can see that, for example, first thing that I noticed, we are using some verbs in the name of the URL or endpoint, and
Exactly.
usually would be better to rely on HTTP methods to communicate what is the scope of the endpoint. And also our design now doesn't look very flexible in a way, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree with your points, Tony. Imagine that we want to add a new resource, the amount of methods that we need to add for that, right? Also, if we want to filter collections, no, yeah, it's a bit difficult to understand how the endpoints are gonna work. Let's go to another solution that now we remove the entity name from the URL and then we put it as a request parameter. Still doesn't look very friendly, right? So this is where it comes the first exercise that you can do if you check out the repository. And then let's go a little bit into that. And you will see that it's quite easy, but it's just to check some good practices that we all know. So basically, this is the repository, as you can see, and I'm using this branch, exercise 1, and then we have a query controller, a could control, several controllers here for users and slab, and you can also play with this HTTP file to retrieve some, for example, if you want to retrieve all the list of users, then you would have it here. The names are, I used a library to make up names, so maybe some of them make sense or some others not. So basically, what do you think about this API, right? So then we have API users, and then if we want to retrieve all of them, then we have a method here, get all. Or if we want to retrieve one, we have get one. We have verbs, as Tony said here, add a new user, update a new user. So it's not what we are used to do. So then here is I propose my first exercise to use to replace it in a way that is more standard. Like in this case, for example, it would be as simple as this, right? I think we are all more used to have something like this. That if you do a get call to API users, you would get a list of users. Slow, yeah. Thank you, Tony. Yeah. Still, the endpoint doesn't look very friendly in my opinion, and we are going to discuss it in the next endpoint, in the next slide. So this is what we call REST standards, even that there is not strict standard, it's just guidelines, what REST proposes. But as Tony was mentioning, we are using nouns and we are relying on the HTTP methods to do the CRUD operations, right? Normally, people use post to create new resources and they use patch to update or partially update resources. This is also very, very nice approach because we can also establish hierarchy between entities. Like for example, in this case, we can see that attendees is a child of slabs. Well, as I said before, in this particular case of this branch, you also have the solution here, just in case you want to check it. It's a possible solution. Maybe you come up with a better one. Well, these are the takeovers for this part. I would say keep your JSON as simple as possible because they are easier to understand, easier to use. Nouns are good, verbs are bad. So try to use the HTTP methods and things like users instead of users add. Then represent relationship in the URLs. Like for example, you have here, like attendees is clearly a child of slabs. In general, follow this approach. Also a very important topic, in my opinion, paginate collections because items tend to grow. Be consistent. This is very important, and we are going to check it in the next slide. And then, of course, a good error handling. Well, first of all, keep your JSON simple. This is very, very important, in my opinion. They are going to be, this is a really nice sentence. They are going to be simple and easy to understand if you stick to the names in your JSON are always property names, and the JSON object always correspond to entities in your API's data model. Of course, it's not always possible, but try to stick to as much as possible to that. And then here about consistency, I would like to do an example. Here, this is the search tweets URL from Twitter. And then just by looking at the URL, what would you assume, let's say? What would you assume just by looking at the URL? Well, first, we could assume that this is the version, right? So maybe they have several versions. Then we have here a verb. Then we have here the noun, I would say in this case tweets, and then JSON. So then just by looking at this URL, I would assume that I can also search for users, right? Maybe I can do 1.1 search users, and maybe they also support more formats, no? Maybe I can do tweets.xml, right? So that's why for me, consistency is an important point. They need to be able, because your APIs are going to be used by computers, but also by humans. So then it's important that it's consistent. Okay, then here you have the API for the Twitter in case you want to check it. And let's move to another topic, which is versioning. I'm sure that most of you have worked with versions, different versions, because it helps you to iterate faster, as this sentence is saying. API evolves because the software evolves, and then it can become a very difficult part to maintain backward compatible changes. So when to do versioning? I think everyone agrees that when a breaking change is made, for example, you change the format of the response, you change the response type, or you remove any part of your API. There are several ways to do versioning. REST doesn't provide specific guidelines, but this is the most common approaches that people use. I put a star here in the first one because it's the one that I guess most of you have used, which is the URI versioning. As you can see here, we are requesting the version 2 for the users. But there are also other versions, other ways, like for example, in this case, using custom request headers, one that I call a set version. And what the Rastafarians, I don't know if you ever heard that term, they like it more, which is using the accept header. And then my personal favorite, which is do nothing. So, which is the most complicated one, and we're gonna see why. Well, first, let's continue with the examples that we checked before, the one about keeping track of the slabs. But now imagine that our software evolves, and now we have three new requirements. We want to add a TIN field, a tax identification number for users. We also may have more than one presenter. So then instead of having one presenter, we may have more than one. And we also want to distinguish if the people that attended that workshop, they did it online or on-site. Think about it for a second. How would you implement it? Well, this is like a very intelligent workflow that I made about when to do an API change. If it is a new field, I would say then you don't need a new version. And if it is not a new field, then think what can you do in order to not to get a new version. I put here the two entities again because I would like to ask Tony about how he would implement these first two requirements. I guess the first one, add a tax identification number field, I think it's just a new field, so then we can live without a new version, right? But what do you think about, Tony, if you have more than one presenter? Would you immediately change presenter for example, presenters, and then you have a set instead of a single user? And then, of course, it's a backward incompatible change, then we need a new version? Or do you think that there are other solutions?
Okay, let's see. Well, one idea that comes to mind is that you can go inside of the user object and add some fields there that specify if is a presenter maybe, but probably I think looking at the user, I think you cannot really do that because it's kind of a generic user, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So maybe what we can do is add, I don't know, another field. So we are still backward compatible. Other presenters, something like that.
Yeah. That's a possible solution. You add a new field in which you have, for example, presenter as the main presenter, and then other presenters like the rest of the people that were presenting it. No, that's a solution that you can provide that it doesn't make a backward incompatible change, and then you don't need a new version. And then this one is a bit more tricky. Imagine that you want to distinguish if the attendees of a slab are online or on-site. And then I leave this open so then you can think about it. How would you implement it? But my takeaway is avoid versioning as much as possible. Sometimes it's impossible, we all know that. But try to look for intelligent solutions because keeping backward compatible changes keeping different versions is a tricky point. So try to look always for how to avoid that. No, I would say. But of course, sometimes, as we said, you have to. So then this is different semantics for versioning. I would say the one that we should use or you should use is this one. I would like to have a V of version before the number. And I don't think that you need this level of granularity, with a major and a minor version or a backfix or even a timestamp or whatever, right? Add a changelog and keep your clients up to date. This is very important, okay? So let's go back to the code.
Manuel, sorry. I would like to add something here. Yeah, for the changelog, so in keeping your clients up to date, what we used to do at our project at KLM was creating a mailing list specifically for all the consumers so that you can tell them exactly what is the deprecation plans for some endpoints, or to, of course, to keep them up to date with the latest change logs from the latest release. because we used to have releases every 2 weeks. So it was very important that all the consumers were up to date on what was happening.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a very good point. If we go back to the code, there is also a version okay. And then we go to versioning. So here, guys, I also have another branch called versioning, in which I try to implement the two first changes that we discussed, adding a theme field and making presenters, let's say that you can have more than one, right? So then for that, what I have here is two controllers. This is a possible solution. It doesn't have to be your solution. It's just to tell you how we can deal in Spring Boot, for example, with different versions. In this case, we did a URL versioning. So then we have here, for this is the controller for the version 1 of the slabs. But we also have here the version 2 of the slabs. As you can see, the DTO is different depending on one or another. And then, of course, the response is different. As we said, I changed the presenter to be from one single presenter to a list. So then it's a backward incompatible change. We need two versions, and we can test it if you want here. This is to retrieve the version 1. And then we see here the presenter is just one single, and then here the presenter is just an array. Okay. Also, a very important point, when you do a new version, even that your some entities didn't change, you still need to update them. So or update the version. So in this case, for example, for the user's endpoint, even that we didn't update anything, well, we added one field, but we still need to support the version 2 to be consistent.
Yeah, exactly. This is something, the first time I started working with APIs a few years back, I got really surprised because I thought, okay, we are upgrading just one endpoint, so only that endpoint will move to version 2, right? Because that's what makes sense. Instead, every time you update one little thing on the entire resource, you have to move the whole API to a version, an extra version, and keep maintaining the previous, right?
Yeah, exactly. So let's go back to the presentation. I think I went quite fast because we are almost at the end. So REST API contracts. Basically, a contract defines what you expect. What endpoints do you expect to be available, and what format do you expect if you call to those endpoints, right? As simple as that. This is an approach that I would like to discuss, contract first, that I think we use it in the hackathon of timesheet. We divided in backend team and a frontend team, and then the backend team, we came up with a draft, and then we propose it to of our API. We propose it to the frontend, in which this case would be the clients, and then they propose some solutions. They try to make it a bit simple, so it would be easier for both of us. So and then it worked quite good. So I would like to mention that, no, that this approach is also very valid. That if the developer first writes the API description, then that description is reviewed by other developers and the clients, and then you get your feedback, and then you implement the API. So then, very important, document your REST APIs, you have very good libraries like Swagger. That is one that I use a lot. And then you can also use, I don't know if you're familiar with it, JSON schema. That is a vocabulary that allows you to validate JSON documents. In this case, for example, this is the user entity. It has a first name and last name and a tax identification number. And then this is the valid schema validation for this entity, which is basically ID is of a type number, first name, last name, and thing are type string. As simple as that. If you want, we can go to the code, and then we check. There is also here what I call a branch called JSON schema, in which is using, we have Swagger to document our APIs. So then you can see here the configuration. And then we also have, if I remember properly, this is not the most elegant solution. It's just to check how it works for you. We define a schema for the user, and then we validate the input against that schema, retrieving a schema validation exception in case we don't fulfill the validation. We'll see it here. For example, imagine that I don't pass the first name, and then I try to do a post. Then I will get a schema validation not passed. This is a custom message that I put, but basically that we can use schema validation to validate our JSONs. And well, this is almost the end of the presentation. I would like to remark that this is an important topic. Craft APIs that developers love. Your APIs are gonna be used by humans also, so then try to strict as possible as you can with the guidelines that they up to date, no, with the best practices that are already in the market. Be consistent, and that's basically it. This is basically it. Here you have some references that I used to make this presentation. And then we can have a turn of question and answer.
Okay. Okay, maybe we can check the live feed if anyone has questions during the presentation, if anyone wrote some questions.
Paul is asking if we are in the same room together.
No, I don't see any relevant question. Let's give the guys a few seconds. Yeah. So if you guys have any questions regarding what you just saw, please let us know. And I still don't see any questions. Let's wait just a few seconds more.
Paul is asking what software did you use to create this presentation? I think, Tony, you can answer that question, right? Because you are being the host.
Yeah, if you're referring, Paul, if you're referring to the live stream, then I'm using OBS. And it's a free software. Otherwise, I think for the presentation of Manuel, I think use the Google Doc, if I'm correct.
Yeah, exactly.
Any more questions? Okay. I don't see any more questions coming, so I would like to thank you very much, Manuel.
Thanks to you, Tony.
And before closing, I would like to thank everyone for joining us, and keep an eye on your inbox, because we are organizing many more of these online dev jams in the near future, and we are actually also looking for your contribution as well. So if you want to present anything that you think you're expert as a field or niche, please drop me a message on Slack or send me a mail. There is a mail in the description. Finally, we need your feedback to improve, because this is our really very first test with this format. So there is also in the description a link for leaving a small feedback, and we would really appreciate if you can help us with that. And if we don't have any more questions, looks like we don't, we wish you a great evening and a nice weekend. And thank you again, Manuel. And
Thanks to you, Danny.
stay safe, guys. Yeah.
Bye bye.